It is wonderful to be here. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for our first event pre-COVID. So 6 years, 5 years, and to share this event with you because it's so important and there is so much to share in this space. I'll briefly provide some overview about International Access to Information Day, which is held every year on the 28th of September. That annual and global celebration recognises the community's right to access information. In 2024, this year, the theme is mainstreaming access to information and participation in the public sector. I think it's timely, and it's timely for a range of reasons, particularly the reasons that will be espoused by our panel today of experts. But before we move to that agenda, I wanted to welcome, with great pleasure, Violet Sheridan, who is a senior Ngunnawal elder, who is going to open our events with an acknowledgement of country and a welcome to country as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. Lucky you come today because tomorrow's going to be 12 degrees. But for all those that live in Canberra, I just want to let the out-of-towners know we are in the best city in Australia. But it is my pleasure to be here in the International Access Information Day. I tried to work out who you were, and talking to this lovely lady as she's explained, because so many of our people have been removed, and we're calling stolen generation. So they were trying to access their information to where they come from, and a lot of our people are still lost today. But you know, we talk about the stolen generation that was removed, but we have more kids today that's been removed, and that same thing is going to be a problem for them as well. They're going to be lost in the system. But it's good that a government department like yourselves, that they can go to and ask for assistance to help find their way back home. So it is my pleasure. I want to introduce myself if you don't know me. My name is Violet Sheridan. I'm a senior Ngunnawal elder. I've lived there for many years. I grew up and just in a little town outside of Canberra called Yass. And my people lived here for many years, but forcibly moved us out. So I have 4 children, and my eldest is 51 today, and he don't want to be 51. So I said, well, then 50s, I think the old go backwards, say 40s. So I'll be 70 soon. I don't want to be 70, I said to him, so I'm going back, I'm 60. So I've got 4 children. My eldest is 51 today. My youngest is 44, and I have 30 grannies. I've got 24 grannies and 6 great-grandchildren. I just had a new one. His name's Clayton, and he's a gorgeous little thing, but he's another male. Too many males. But that's a little bit about me. So next time you see me, you'll know my story. So I always have been taught a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners of the land welcoming you. But it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you're meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit about not going into someone else's house or home unless you're welcome or invited. The reason for this custom is to protect your spirit while you are on our land. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit, walking into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Ngunnawal Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here in the room. But I'd also like to acknowledge the commissioners in the room and CEOs in the room, and all the non-Indigenous people in the room. And is there any online? And online. So in keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure once again to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. And on behalf of my family and the other Ngunnawal families, I say welcome, welcome, and I wish you all the best, because it's an important government department and will assist people that have lost in the system, people that don't know their background. So thank you all so much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you so much, Violet, and thank you for joining with us. That seems to be my tag that's roaming from one person to another.
I've lost mine, so I'm just floating around in the wind.
Thank you. That was inspirational and also acknowledges just one of the really important use cases for the right to access information, to provide information to people who experienced out-of-home care and to give them back a sense of identity and a sense of where they sit in a world that is much broader than the one that they were taken to. So thank you very much. It really inspires the purpose that we're here today for. So as I said earlier, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this, my first International Access to Information Day as the Australian Information Commissioner. I'm thrilled to share this event with you. I'm learning a great deal in this new role, and you in particular are a rich source of learning for me. I hope that's not a unilateral relationship. I hope that we can share information with you today and share learning. And in fact, we're committed to that agenda. I think you've already seen that through the work we've been doing with practitioners groups to better understand your needs, to better target those needs, and to focus on a twofold approach to making compliance easier, but also to advancing the information access agenda. And that is to build capacity within the APS, but also to explain more, to provide guidance, and to advocate for better systems, for better operational environments, greater proactive release, all of the things that are going to make your roles a lot easier, but also importantly to give you purpose and to ensure that your leaders acknowledge that purpose. So our commitment to you in uplifting agency capability was made prior to us being advised of the theme of this year's International Access to Information Day. That mainstreaming within the APS and building capacity is very much at the forefront of our future agenda as well. And why now? Why do we need to do this now? Especially when the right to access information has been around for a very long time. It's Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, published in 1948. So I think we're mainstreaming now, and that's why the UNESCO has identified this as a focus, really because of the changes in our government landscape, particularly digital government. Digital government has been transformational. If we think about the ease of communication, the reliance upon business analytics, the ready access to data and information, those developments have really transformed the APS. And in part, digital government has transformed the government-citizen relationship in many, but not all aspects. I want to turn to that issue by way of an example. This year, our IPS survey provided the following results. In 2023-24, staff costs were 25% higher in processing of FOIs than they were in 22-23. So the spend reported to the OIC was 81.66 million compared with 65.34 million in 2022-23. That was driven by an increase in the time that staff spent on FOI. So the average staffing days has risen steadily for 10 years. In 2023-24, the average was 4.2 days, which is 20% higher than 22-23, when the average was 3.5 days. In 21-22, this was 33 days. So overall, we've seen an elevation in costs and staffing hours, and we need to understand why that is, why compliance appears on those metrics to have become harder. So the outcomes we can speculate about. Are they a result of complex requests, ill-framed requests, a default position in going to our legal branches for management of FOI applications, when really this is very much an administrative decision-making regime? And that's a capability that you all possess, and it is a prized capability within the APS. Is it also as a result of a lesser investment in capability building and training and systems to support you in undertaking this really important statutory function? There's one thing that I don't think we can claim is influencing that drive of costs and hours, and that's the number of applications, because they only rose by 1%, and they haven't risen in a discernible way over the last decade. So we do need to understand this dilemma more. We do need to be looking at providing solutions to what is a trajectory of growth, not of volume, but of time and costs. And we do need to work with you to better understand your environment and to address and try and arrest that trajectory. So one potential cure is to better harness technology, and the other is the one I've mentioned, which is capability uplift. These two cures, if you like, we'll discuss today, and we'll discuss them with our panel of experts throughout the morning, and turn to our experts in the room, particularly our FOI Commissioner, Tony Pirani. Welcome to the event, Tony, and thank you for all the work you've done in backgrounding this event. So much substance has been put into this event as really part of our agenda for Uplift. And thank you also to Russell, who is in the room somewhere, who has been front and centre of ensuring that this event is the success that it clearly appears to be. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts. We're extremely pleased to have a panel that comprises experts in governing, applying and preserving information, and who offer so much inspiration in this digital environment. Each one of them bring a particular focus, but our common ground is that they operate in a cutting-edge environment and act in the public interest. I'm confident that our panel will inspire us today. We have Gail Milnes, who is the National Data Commissioner, Chris Fechner, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Digital Transformation Office, and Amanda Cattermole, Chief Executive Officer of Digital Health. And they will each present and give you some insights into their cutting edge work. Then we'll have an opportunity to engage with them. Now, secret here, I haven't prepared any questions for this panel, so we're reliant upon you. And I am sure that they will provide enough inspiration to stimulate a really valuable discussion. Welcome, panel. Over to Gail, first of all.
Well, thanks very much, Liz. And I'm starting with a frog in my throat, so hopefully it moves on. It's great to be here and like Liz, to see the buzz and the energy in the room. Terrific. I do want to pay my respects to the traditional owners and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people joining us today. And thanks to Violet for the inspiring welcome to country. A few weeks ago, I had an amazing week in the Chiricha National Park, west of Alice Springs, and I walked parts of the Larapinta Trail and had plenty of time then to reflect on the enormous debt of gratitude that we owe Indigenous Australians, in this case, the Arunta people, for their custodianship of the land over thousands of years. As Violet said, the oldest culture in the world. And thanks to Liz and your team for the invitation to speak today on access to information. It's such an important topic, as Liz said, and one that's closely aligned with my role as the National Data Commissioner and the work of my office. So, first point, data, a valuable national resource. So as Australian government agencies, and many of you will work with Australian government agencies, many of you here today, you're custodians of a valuable national resource, and that's data. data about the welfare of Australians, about our natural environment, data about the Australian economy. There are large integrated assets. Get my slides going here. Oh, it's already done. Thank you. Take me back. I need to go the other way. Okay, here we are. So here are some of the large integrated assets that we've got. You might be familiar with them. We have great names like PLIDA, the Personal Level Integrated Data Asset, the Business Longitudinal Analysis Data Environment, you might know as BLADE. Both are administered by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the National Data Hub administered by the Australian Institute of Welfare, and Domino. It's got a great name, Data Over Multiple Instances, capturing, but the impressive thing is it captures all the Centrelink administered payments, such as family benefits, rent assistance, childcare subsidy, age pension, AusStudy, New Start allowance, and the data set is administered by the Department of Social Services. So this slide gives you a sense of the value of these assets as a whole, but also the richness of their components. And with them, we can see so much, pretty much in real time, about Australians and how they're faring, about our economy, how it's going, and about our natural environment. When I was doing my preparation for today, I thought, you know, I better do a Google search about why data matters. And the first thing that came up was a Forbes quote. And as it stands, as it turned out, that was actually, I thought, the best one I found. In the world, and I'll give you some aspects of it. In the world today, data is probably the thing that matters most. It can predict events. It can tell us what we need to do next. It can expose inefficiencies and disadvantage. It can reveal the truth. So how do we use, or how do Australian government officials and others use data? Well, to warn us about natural disasters, to help us manage natural disasters, to tackle violence, domestic violence against women and children, to help farmers know what crops to plant, when to plant them, when to harvest them, to inform the rollout and effectiveness of vaccines, to run the national electricity grid, to administer the payment systems, and to make decisions on interest rate settings. So it's all pervasive. Data is all pervasive. My second message. So what are we doing to increase the availability and use of that public data? Here are some of the uses I touched on. Here we are with the data scheme. So reflecting the important role of data, the Australian Government's 2023 Data and Digital Strategy restated its commitment to requiring all government entities to make non-sensitive data open by default. So it's a really important cornerstone, if you like, of the access agenda. And it's a commitment requiring all government entities. So it's a commitment that we all have. Now, the scheme for sharing Australian government data, we call it the Data Scheme because it's established by the Data Availability and Transparency Act, builds on the government's open data commitment. It's all about increasing the availability and use of data collected by the Australian government. And the purpose of that is to deliver public benefit, better government policies, programs and services, and world-leading research and development. Flick my page here. So how does the data scheme work? So this picture tries to help you understand that. And if you think about what's up there, there's those centre boxes there. The first thing is, or the really key part of the legislation is that authorises Australian government agencies to share the data they hold. Stated otherwise, it provides a legal pathway for them to share data where they don't already have one. So it's a very powerful piece of legislation in that sense. While the Act doesn't require data custodians to share their data, data custodians should take account of the objects of the Act when considering a data request. And the first object of the Act is to serve the public interest by promoting better availability of private sector data. So my guidance to Australian government agencies and officials is look for a way to say yes. Share your data safely, but look for a way to say yes. Look for a way to meet the request. Data custodians are also, and that's you, that's Australian government agencies, that's that box over the right. Data custodians are required to share their data, to consider a data sharing request within a reasonable period. So you need to act in a timely way, something that's considered on a case-by-case basis. But to give you a guide, within a week, we're looking for you to acknowledge the request. Within 2 weeks, if you think you require further information about the request, we're looking for you to do that within a 2-week period. Go back and say, we need more. Is this really what you want? Can you clarify for us what you're looking for? And within a month, we're looking for you to take a decision. If you refuse the request, there's a bit of a nudge in the legislation. You must provide reasons in writing and within 28 days of a decision being made. So all these things are encouraging you to take the request seriously and respond in a timely way and look for a way to say yes. Importantly, you must also apply the scheme's best practices or safeguards when you're sharing the data. And these are the white boxes around the edge. So just to step through those 3 boxes there, the scheme's about sharing Australian government data. So data custodians are the Australian government agencies that are custodians of the data. A user is someone that can make a request to the Australian government agency, and a data service provider is an intermediary, someone that might help the sharing of the data. These best practices around here are what you must apply when you share the data. And this means, for example, you can only share data with an accredited or trusted user. And you must have a data sharing agreement in place. And that data sharing agreement must apply the data sharing principles. And they go to making sure that you've got the right project or the purposes for which you're sharing the data is a public interest one. You've got the right people that you're working with, people that are appropriately skilled to handle and use the data. The settings right, the security settings and the privacy settings in particular. The data, you're giving only the minimum data needed to answer the question or for the project, the appropriate and the minimum necessary. And the output, you've got a good sense of where the outputs of the project. And when you do that, you'll cover off on privacy and ethics considerations. Now, the role of the National Data Commissioner, supported by my office, is to oversee the scheme and to regulate it. And this involves accrediting the entities and checking that they've got the right data and governance management arrangements in place, the right ICT and other security settings, and the people capability to handle the data. We also make sure the custodians are considering the requests and doing that in a timely way, and that scheme participants are responding, and that scheme participants are applying the best practices. And we can take enforcement action if scheme participants are not playing by the rules. Another of the regulatory functions is to handle complaints from scheme participants and others. So there's a right of reply there, or another mechanism for learning, another mechanism for accountability. The National Data Commissioner is also required to keep a public register of scheme participants and data sharing agreements and report annually on the scheme. So it's an important transparency piece there. So it's a regulation that brings transparency and trust and positions us to maintain and build the public trust in the data that's being shared. The Commissioner's other functions are to provide advice and guidance to the Minister and scheme participants about its operation. And we educate Australian government agencies and others about best practice data sharing and handling, and provide the tools for you to share your data safely. And that takes you to this bottom blue bar here that talks about data discovery and data place. So there's 2 things I want to call out here. The first is that in July, we launched the beta version of the Australian Government Data Catalogue. And researchers can use the catalogue to find data assets held by Australian government agencies. So this is an important accessibility piece, right? The catalogue contains about 60,000 data assets. The majority of these are publicly available through data.gov.au and Geoscience Australia's product catalogue, with an additional 230 restricted data assets contributed by 12 Australian government agencies. We're encouraging and supporting Australian government agencies to have a complete and up-to-date inventory of their data assets in place. It's what you need as Australian government agencies to best protect and utilise your data. And it's also what you need so you can contribute your assets to the data catalogue and people can find the data assets that you hold. And then they can make a request for that data. As you complete your data inventories, we're asking you to flag data assets if they contain information about Indigenous Australians. And this relates very closely to the points that Violet raised. We've made a commitment to provide greater access to Indigenous communities about Indigenous data. And this is one way that we can deliver on that commitment. And then it will make it easier for Indigenous Australians to then find the data that they're interested in. The catalogue's integrated with DataPlace, which is our second tool that's referred to here. After completing a search, the user is directed to where the data asset is publicly available or to DataPlace to make a request for their asset. DataPlace is a digital platform that we've built that brings together those wanting access to data with data custodians. Some describe it as a dating app for data. Others describe it as the PDMS for data. It's both, actually. For those Australian government agencies that don't have a digital system for managing your data sharing, I encourage you to take a look at DataPlace and start using it. It'll give you a line of sight on what data you share, who you share it with, and the purposes for which you share it. You can also be assured then that you've shared the data using the data scheme's best practices. So there's a management piece in there, and there's an important assurance piece if you're using DataPlace, because all of those best practices are basically coded into DataPlace. Still having problems with this frog. So how are we going? 2 years in, and we've laid the foundations for the data scheme. We've built the tools for sharing data safely, DataPlace and the Australian Government Data Catalogue that I mentioned. And there are now 32 accredited entities, 28 users and 12 data service providers. This gives you a sense of who they are. A good smattering there of Australian government agencies, some of our most data active Australian government agencies, most states and territories, and 7 universities. So we now have a core trusted data sharing community. And most importantly, we're seeing data requests being made using DataPlace and data being shared. We've registered 4 data sharing agreements that help create the National Disability Data Asset. And it serves a really important purpose. It will allow governments and others to better support people with disability, their carers, and the community. We'll continue to prioritise support for building the National Disability Data Asset and providing access to the asset, and targeting other new use cases and providing a concierge service for organisations to make their first and repeat data requests. We're learning a lot, adapting and improving our tools and approach as we go. We held our first annual data forum, annual forum for data scheme participants in June to get feedback on our performance and learn more about their priorities. Their top priority was making it easier to share data. For example, through better integration and linkage with DataPlace with agency-specific systems. So if you're getting a request, I encourage you to use DataPlace and respond to that request through that. I caution you against emailing the person and saying, could you please withdraw that request and send me an email to this address? That's not what our scheme participants are looking for. They're looking for a one-stop shop. They're looking for it to happen in a timely way, and they're looking for an efficient and an easy way to access the data. The second thing people have raised with us is greater recognition by Australian government agencies of accreditation status. So if you're receiving a request, we want you to acknowledge that that entity is accredited, and don't ask them the same question that we've asked them. We've given them the tick of approval to say they've got the data systems, they've got the data management and governance capability, they've got the people capability. You will still have to ask them some questions to complete your data sharing agreement and around the 5 safes or the data sharing principles. But you need to start by acknowledging that they're already accredited. So that's an important thing. Now, in the spirit of International Access to Information Day, let me close off with a few calls to action and giving you our contact details. If you're not yet onboarded, if you don't yet have a complete and up-to-date inventory of data assets, make it a priority to get one and link it to the Australian Government Data Catalogue. And we're here to support you on that. And we've got guidance available for you on that. If you're not yet onboarded to DataPlace, get on board and start using it to manage the requests, but also use it as your system to manage your data sharing. If you're not yet, I showed you the entities of accredited entities, the list of accredited entities. If you're not yet accredited as a data user, start your application. And that way you can also gain access to information and data you haven't been able to before, and use that data to support your organisation's entity, your organisation's mission. If you're yet to make a data sharing request using DataPlace, make one. Get in contact with us. We're here to help you do all of that. And my final request for you is to share with us how you're using data to deliver value for our citizens, better government policies, programs and services, as well as research outcomes. Your stories are important to help Australians understand how we're using their data to deliver better outcomes for them and build their trust and confidence in us. So we're keen to hear your stories and keen to hear about the good work you're doing. I'll also mention that we have the APS Awards Dinner, Data Awards Dinner coming up, and the Australian Government Data Forum on the 13th and the 14th of November. So I want you to get your tickets for that and join us to support and celebrate data innovation and excellence in the APS. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I don't think we could have asked for a better introduction to the concept that we work within an ecosystem of information access. There's no exclusive single statute that governs providing access to information. Whilst we have the FOI legislation, we have administrative schemes, we have other shared schemes. Those schemes operate according to a couple of principles that you're all incredibly familiar with. And they are timeliness and robust decision making. And I think we heard about that today, which is wonderful to see those themes that have been traditionally under an access to information statute manifest as we build access to information throughout our government activities. I think you also helpfully highlighted, straight back to the FOI Act, Section 3, and the importance of treating this information as a national resource and using it for the public interest and advancing our ability to better serve the Australian community. Now, I was incredibly impressed, if we move to our next speaker, much the same after our first speaker, but when I came to this role and met with Chris and saw the work that his agency has done in terms of the protections that apply to us as we outsource some of our services and engagement for the provision of services with third-party providers, so non-government providers. The sorts of advocacy I was doing in my former role in New South Wales are actually all built in to the work that Chris has done to protect people, looking at the notion of where information is held, who's had access to that information internally by way of audit logs, but also externally. How do we allow citizens to access that information? How does government retain its ability to control something that it has engaged with third-party providers for? So I want to share that reassurance with you and many other things in Chris's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here today. As Liz talked about, I'm a very long-term digital person and a long-term government person. One of the great things about combining the two is that digital is a mechanism to advance government and advance society, and it accelerates in a lot of ways. So I'm going to start with a little bit about FOI and the context where it relates to us. So the DTA does work across a number of things: strategy, policy, architecture, sourcing, and assurance. And Liz talked about our role in procurement. So very much of the government is underpinned by digital, and very much of the government's digital is underpinned by third parties doing work. One of the things that we actually do is help with the transparency. So we spend about 10% of our budget around the digital space, and we spend long-term about $2 billion every year on investments in those particular things. It has a really big impact on policy delivery, service delivery, and internal capabilities of government. So understanding how we use information and how it's available to people goes pretty much with the aspects of the reason for FOI. So how do we advance policy? How do we advance service delivery? And how do we actually keep those aspects about people participating with the government? So I've just come back from an open government forum overseas, and one of the things that really came through there is that governments that engage digitally and can engage effectively digitally have got a higher degree of participation with their citizens, and it contributes to a stronger and more participatory democracies. So one of the things that we really admire about this particular thing is the information publication scheme. And that's about the proactive, the planned release of how information gets out into the community. And certainly, I think I come from a background of states and territories as well as the Commonwealth. The states have got a very strong view about proactive release about information, and many governments have got the requirement to really push towards it. And you heard from Gail and Liz about the Commonwealth's obligations and those particular things. So we have things like the Data and Digital Government Strategy, which Gail mentioned. We have things like the DTA's procurement catalogues. We also have, and one of the things I'm going to talk about today, is the concept of the starting to deploy artificial intelligence across the government for the purposes of doing many of those things I talked about. Improving service delivery, improving government capabilities internally, but also creating policy and doing things like that. So the overlap that I'm really going to talk about is with AI. AI, especially generative AI, has pushed us really quickly into understanding those aspects of digital, which we've kind of been able to go slow with before. Australians have a very high expectation that AI will actually enhance outcomes for them in society. They have a very low trust of government using AI for the betterment of the society. So there is also a lot of fear around government agencies using artificial intelligence in their own roles. And that's been exacerbated by things like the data matching exercises around robo-debt, which has put a bit of an institutional stain on the Commonwealth in that way. But what we've also got is really rapidly emerging capabilities. When the first AI strategy was considered at the start of the Data and Digital Strategy, then when I first came to the Commonwealth, AI was a data science function. It was not a general public capability. So this rapid emergence has also led us to a point where we can't necessarily easily keep up with that. And when we can't keep up with it, the trust and confidence of the citizens and businesses of Australia that we're using it can be eroded. So part of what we're looking at doing is understanding how, with declarations like the Australian AI Ethics, that we are able to build trust and confidence. Building trust and confidence in the context of AI is largely about providing that information about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and where we're using it very publicly, making it proactively positioned so that we understand how it's working, that we understand how people can consider whether they like that use case or not, how it's been assessed in terms of trustworthiness, accuracy, risk, but also how people can engage, going back to that thing about participatory democracy, how they can engage if they want us to do things or they don't want us to do things. And this goes very much to the point of government's purpose is to improve the amenity of society. It's also to be accountable to society. So the way that we're considering AI is in the context of FOI and in the context that we want to ensure that we're producing the best outcomes that we can for people and for businesses in Australia. So the policy that I wanted to talk about today is for the responsible use of AI inside of government. Now, there is broader impacts, like you may have heard about the voluntary code of AI safety that Department of Industry, Science and Resources has put out. Our policies fit within the constraints of the broader economy policies. But one of the things I want to talk about, this is something that's been going on for about a year and a half now, on the basis that we've been working with states and territories to make sure that we've got consistent expectations and disclosures about how we're going to use artificial intelligence for the purposes of government at states, territories and Commonwealth. But this is specifically the Commonwealth approach to this. And it applies to all Commonwealth corporate entities, came into effect, I think, on the 1st of September. And the couple of things that I'm going to talk about are some of the first standards that have come out, and they really go to the heart of FOI. We want to be able to allow the Commonwealth to take the great advantage of artificial intelligence. There would not be a person in the room who has not engaged with a large language model and used it in some way. There would not be one person in this room who has not been the subject or the output of something that has gone through an AI instance. That there will be people, whether that's a representation or a group or anything like that. So it is applying to everybody, and it's applying more and more. And it has a really large impact on the way that government's going to act in the future. It goes from the concept of how do we use data that we put into it to potentially train models? How do we actually ensure that models behave the way we expect them to by putting in safety controls about what they can actually do? And how do we actually look at the inferences, the outcomes of some of these things and how they impact on people and whether they can actually transparently be understood as to how they came to that particular outcome. We also need to make sure that as we build, we start to build in a way that grows over time. So we think about how do we start with the lower risk use cases and build up in those spaces? How do we look at the emerging technology? Remember, November 21 was the ChatGPT's first instance. If you go back to 1998, I think was the launch of Google. I think 2008 was the launch of the App Store on iPhone. If you look at the difference between 2022 and 2024 in terms of the advancements of the generative AI cohort, you'd see it's quite revolutionary by comparison. So how do we actually pick it up and use it in a way that actually gives the government, gives the people confidence that we're using it effectively, but it also gives us internally confidence that we are using it effectively? So there are some policy expectations, and the one that I've highlighted there is transparency of application by agencies, and I'll talk more about that. But we've also called out accountability. So these are publicly available statements. Within 90 days of the policy starting, every agency in the Commonwealth's got an obligation to show who their accountable officials are for the application of AI within their entity. That can be an individual, it can be a group. It's not necessarily your IT boffin, it's not necessarily your records person, it's not necessarily your risk officer. It's for agencies to consider the context of the standard and make a decision as to who is the most appropriate person to do that, or group of people to do that. It's also incredibly important that we give information about, are people ready for it? So the DTA is also working on some minimum training capabilities that explain the difference between decision systems, which are rules-based and they have fixed outcomes, versus artificial intelligence systems, which are probabilistic and have got a likelihood of outcomes, and understanding the discrete difference between those things. You'll have seen instances where people talk about anything that works on a rules-based system can be considered to be AI. And in the broadest context, that's true. But what we're really talking about here is where the path to the outcome is not directly fixed. It's done as a system of probability. So people need to know that if you ask Copilot, did anyone participate in the Copilot trial? Yes. Did it change your lives or not? No. So the questioning about that is if we're using these things, how do we actually know whether we can trust them or not? Because anybody who's worked in the sector, who's used something like GPT or Copilot, has clearly seen the outcomes of hallucinations, has clearly seen the outcomes of misinterpretations. And we have to actually start to get to the understanding that when you are a accountable official or a person or a public servant who is using AI for the purposes of extending or enhancing or augmenting your work, there is a need for you to understand the outcome that you're actually committing to from those things. It's like the early days of, introduction of new technologies for systems. One of the ways that you actually test new systems is by checking that the outcomes are the same in the manual process as it is with the systematic process. And we're actually helping a little bit with a mechanism for people to understand risk, understand the application of AI through the Commonwealth AI Assurance Framework, which will be piloted in some agencies over the next 6 months before it goes into policy positions. Now, this is not me pretending that I can do string art. This is actually an understanding of how we're actually going to make clear to people how we're using AI in the Commonwealth. So we're talking about on the left-hand side here, the AI usage, in my left, sorry, not yours. The left-hand side is AI usage is about where we're going to apply it. So people don't care too much about using AI in workplace productivity, for instance. But when you actually make decision-making and administrative action and you'll make it apply to service delivery, people care a lot. And the way that we're actually looking at these, so image processing for scientific purposes, CSIRO does a really good job of finding stars in space or black holes in space simply by looking for anomalies in images. No one's going to get particularly frightened about that application, except maybe the Martians who don't want us to know that we're there. But other things will. If we start using workplace productivity and we go into compliance and fraud detection, like they start looking at logs for when people go in and out of buildings and look at those on timesheets, people get really concerned about it. So the transparency statements that we're actually putting forward as part of the standard under the policy is all about making sure that people know how we're using it, what we're using it for in the domains that we're actually using it. And we believe that this transparency will actually give people the trust and confidence to use it. It will also put the people that are in charge of this process, give them the cautionary framework to say when they should actually take a breath and step back and consider whether they should or should not do these things. Now, the other one that I actually quickly wanted to touch on was about major projects. I talked about $2 billion worth of projects going through pretty much every year. And that's a lot of money that could be spent on something else. We believe very strongly in the DTA that digital is an enabler of better outcomes for government. And in doing so, we want to make sure that all the investments that are made in government are actually doing what they say they will do. They will meet the times, they will meet the outcomes, they will understand the expense for them. And what we've actually set up, and this goes towards transparency about, are we making the right investment decisions? Do the public understand where we're actually making investment decisions? And how are those investment decisions realising the benefits that we say that we are, and how we do it? In February last year, this year, sorry, not last year, I'm already into next year. February this year, we actually released the first of the transparency reports for the major projects inside of the Commonwealth. It's on the DTA's website, and I would actually encourage people to go and have a look at that, as is the AI policy on digital.gov.au. What I would actually say to people is that we spend a lot and we are sometimes not quite as transparent as we need to be in the use and application of digital technology. Now, one of the things that closing or not being transparent about that is it increases distrust of future investment in digital and ICT. If we don't invest in digital and ICT, we will simply not be able to keep up with the explosion of information, the explosion of demand for access to services, the explosion in demand for access to information resources across the Commonwealth. So for us to be successful, for us to fulfill our role as improving the amenity of society and being accountable to society, things like this are very important for us to drive the light into what is often considered to be a fairly dark art. So the art of digital and ICT, the expense category of digital and ICT. Whereas if we look at the 21st century, there won't be anybody whose role isn't underpinned by digital. There was a very clever statement that was talking about the impact of AI in the workforce. People are very concerned about that. But one of the things that came out from a lot of the research, and it goes right back to the Industrial Revolution, they always think that jobs are going to be reduced. They're transformed, they're uplifted, they're changed. And I think AI is going to be no different than that, but we have to be very conscious about it. So one of the statements that's come out is nobody that's in a role is going to be replaced explicitly by AI. They may be replaced by somebody who knows that role and knows AI. So what we need to do is make sure that we embrace the opportunities of these things and manage the risks associated with them. So these things like transparency dashboards, we have a transparency report around all of our procurement inside the DTA. Liz talked about that. And I wanted to just make sure that we've got lots of things that people can go and see that create trust in using data and digital across the economy, because if we embrace it, we take it up, we're going to be able to deliver much more and support democracy much more. You may have seen recently, and I'm just about to close, you may have seen recently the introduction of legislation for the removal of deep fakes across there. These are the sort of things that government needs to be in front of. And if we're not engaged heavily in this particular space, then we are not in a good position to set policy on those. We're not in a good position to create systems that support the management of the controls that we want to put in place. So you can go and look at that. And that is me. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Chris. That was an incredibly rich presentation. It brought home for me those cornerstones of FOI, transparency and accountability, and how in this new frontier we embed that in our systems. I just want to touch on an issue that Chris raised around the use of AI or machine-enhanced decision-making. We're in a position where we can look to Europe, we can look around the globe about how those laws have developed. One that I find really interesting in the FOI context is the French Digital Republic law, which says there are 3 requirements whenever you're using machine-enhanced decision-making, and that is as a government entity, and that is to tell people you're using it, to provide a general explanation of how it's being used, and upon request, so think FOI, a more detailed explanation of how it's being used. And I think those features embed the right of access to information in this new frontier. It's very important to look at that, because if we think about what we do every day, particularly in administrative decision-making is based on challenging a decision, particularly a decision of government, is based on the notion that you will be able to point to error. How do you do that when we are using multiple data sets to inform our decision making? And who owns that data set? And which one is it? And how has it created potentially the bias, the hallucinating effect that we see in some of the outcomes of these decisions? So it's fascinating to be in this space of FOI, access to information, transparency and accountability, and advancing that compact between governments and the citizens they serve as we embark on this new frontier. Another person, Amanda, who is about to join us, will pick up on another really crucial part to the information that government holds about the citizens it serves and that you are custodians of, that you are stewards of, and that's sensitive health data. And that gives us the ability to gain some insights into the interface between information access and privacy, and how, as practitioners, and how we as people who serve the community are able to reconcile sometimes those tensions that exist, which is my great honour as Information Commissioner to be working with 2 other commissioners under a 3-commissioner model for the first time in some time, and to be able to explore this and better serve you and your needs as we advance these agendas. So welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. And absolute perfect intro to exactly where I was going to go. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people. We're just so privileged to have the kind of welcome to country that we have from senior elders like Violet, and remind ourselves as we stand here together the great privilege of standing in more than 60,000 years of history and custodianship, and to all those online in all the remarkable parts of Australia that you're in, and that custodianship that is shared right across Australia. One of the things that I absolutely love about coming to have these conversations together, as well as the sharing and engagement we'll have together shortly, is listening to colleagues and realising just how many more synergies, opportunities, inflection points that there are together. This is a remarkable time to be engaged in talking about, thinking about information sharing. And as you said, Elizabeth, the challenges, the intersections, and the complexity that it is absolutely our obligation to navigate through together for the purposes that we are so privileged to have working in government, and that is to ensure that we're supporting Australians and improving their lives in many ways. And the one that I want to touch on, as Elizabeth said, is around health. But as you hear that, there are obviously areas that apply to all of the areas that you work in as well. And the issues that we're facing are faced right across government in a whole range of ways. When I have a chat, I often like to start with this quote, really thinking about what is it that we're talking about here. And Minister Butler, I think, coined it beautifully by talking about digital as the single greatest opportunity to transform healthcare. And the reason it's great is that one of the things that it does really fully, that I think is part of this world that we're in right now, is thinking about digital innovation as an enabler for policy reform. And in this case, the reform of the health system. And that's been given life to in a range of ways at the moment, including the Strengthening Medicare agenda. And if you just think, I just want to touch on what that agenda looks like for a minute for those who are less familiar with this part of government policy work right now. It is deeply about bringing Australians fully into the centre of their own healthcare journeys, which sounds obvious, but really critical that you think about flipping the system so that Australians are absolutely the architects of their own healthcare journeys, and that their teams are connected around them, providing holistic care in a multidisciplinary team environment, having the information they need, and that's where we'll pick up the story here together today, to provide the best quality care, having that together, knowing the whole person and being able to share information together for the purposes of that person's better health. And as we do this, it's been quite an interesting journey, because this has really been an inflection point, the sense that digital innovation is an enabler for this policy reform agenda. And there's a range of ways in which it is, I think, unprecedented in the way this is happening in Australia. One of them is this sense of this baked into the policy environment. The second is the extraordinary collaboration that is going on across the states and territories and the Commonwealth, across the industries that support healthcare and right through the healthcare system, as well as, and I'll touch on this a bit more in a minute, because again, it goes to today, what it is that Australians want and what they're expecting of their healthcare system. And a few things have really become into stark relief as we've sort of elevated and amplified this health reform agenda in this new way. And one of them is that we've got a bunch of things in place that actually turn out to be critical cornerstones if we're going to go on this journey in a way that is going to support Australians, but as Elizabeth said, make sure that we sit properly nested within the challenges of information sharing, but supporting privacy and security and maintaining the trust of Australians in their systems. And as it turns out, and I'm going to talk a bit about My Health Record, as some of you will know, part of my agency's role is to steward the My Health Record system on behalf of Australians. But one of the things that is interesting that's become really clear is some of the things that were baked into the legislation, baked into the philosophical underpinnings of the system, have turned out to be absolutely critical as we go on this really unprecedented journey. And I want to sort of look at them, not just because My Health Record matters in this conversation, because we're talking about information, about your information, and about how we support sharing of information in a safe way. But because this is an increasingly complicated environment, we want to make sure that we continue to maintain the right settings and the trust that they engender. So I want to touch on a few of them because they've really become the cornerstones of the way in which we are sort of being able to go forward in this agenda. So firstly, I'll touch on them slightly differently to the way they are here, but this just gives you a sort of a bit of a visual overview. So first one is, if you look at, say, take My Health Record as a cornerstone for consumer-based health information. So the ability for you to have at your fingertips your own health information. It operates under its own legislation. That is really critical, that it was set up that way so that you have a system in place, a framework, a set of underpinnings for that set that were designed to have a clear set of roles and responsibilities, of which ours is a significant one, but there are a range of others, including Elizabeth and others. Making sure that there are safeguards, that there are registration of those who operate in the system, including all the healthcare providers and so on who work in it. And it's designed to make sure that information is accessible so long as it's authorised by the record holder. And that it also in a flip, but a really critical one, is protected from unauthorised use and access and breaches. And that means that we together, you, me, all of us, can choose to share our health information with whom we want and on the basis that we want to. The Act also establishes a privacy framework. So in addition to our obligations under the Privacy Act, establishes its own one which specifies in a very deep way with significant penalties, collection, use, disclosure and so on, to make sure that there is that protection. So finding the balance in a complex information sharing environment with those protections. And they set an even higher bar than the Privacy Act. We comply, of course, with both schemes and support information, provide reporting and information under both schemes. But again, to make sure we engender that trust, that protection that then enables information sharing. The Act has its own data breach regime as well that supports compliance and with particular roles for the Australian Information Commissioner. Secondly, and really critically in this scheme, consent is key. And this has turned out to be absolutely vital as we go on a journey about Australians as the absolute architects of their own health information. So it's a consumer-controlled health record, your record. And that means you choose who to share it with, on what basis you share it, and that can be turned on and off at any time. And that was how it was set up at the beginning. That philosophical underpinning was baked into the way this was conceived of. And really interestingly, as we talk to people around the world, because this is really a global enterprise at the moment, an information sharing agenda in health and many other areas, but really strongly in health. There is a lot of countries done all sorts of great things and we're learning all the time. But one thing a number of them have said is having baked in a consent based model up front is absolutely the key. And that hasn't happened in every place because these things have happened organically. So it's really interesting when you reflect back on the beginnings, what things kind of bake in as the critical cornerstones. And as we are in this new policy environment, which is going to amplify sharing, and I'll get to that in a second, the notion of a consent system becomes one of the absolutely critical bulwarks in that environment. And that is one in which we are going to move from what I'd call nice to have regime for information sharing into My Health Record to a share by default agenda. So picking up that same by default kind of a philosophy that is also coming through in a whole range of other ways. Now, in the health environment, that is starting with pathology and diagnostic imaging. That is where government is going to start with this share by default agenda. And the idea is that it moves through. So clinicians will no longer be just nice to have. Could you pop that in? It will be by default that information will go in. And the more it is there, the more you've got it available to you and so on. And so that's really critical when you think about being able to use the system in a whole range of other ways. And we'll talk about the other use of data, so the broader kind of disaggregated, de-identified data in a minute. Secondly, it's based on consumer choice. So again, that notion, it is up to us as Australians who and how we want to share with. There's also prohibitions in the Act, so really clear prohibitions that make sure that there's things that you absolutely can't share in relation to, including insurance and employment matters, really obvious policy reasons. But that was really critical too when Australians were having this debate about an information system that is ours, about our health. Those concerns were absolutely at the forefront and reflected really strongly in the way that the Act was created. And then on the flip side, a range of provisions about when we as an agency might be required to share information. And again, you can see the dichotomies and the challenges that are faced there, and they're very limited, they're very prescribed, and of course they include things like courts, tribunals, coroners, and more interestingly in the sense of there's more challenges in emergency situations. So there was always an understanding of there may need in an emergency a clinician's ability to access information that I might not have said in my normal circumstances I want them to access. You can see the challenges that part brings and how we support that while also absolutely holding true to the consent model that underlies the legislation. And that's been the subject of joint work over a long period of time with the states and territories, with Elizabeth and the team, and making sure that we can find that right balance and articulate that in a way that will maintain the trust but support the clinical safety of Australians in those moments. And there's a couple of other things that matter too. So one of them is the Healthcare Identifier Service. It sits alongside the record, and that's there to make sure that we know who you are and every clinician in Australia and who they are in the system, uniquely and with authority, because of course it matters that we know who everyone is. We know what authorisations they have and do not have to access that information, and we know that you are you. And so that's a really critical underpinning as well. And so as we think about this, as data and information becomes more central to the system, more central to the support for the policy change environment, it is absolutely critical that this sits at the heart of it. And this, in terms of our role at the agency, this lies at the very heart of who we are and what we do. But interestingly, although the My Health Record, is really a critical product, if you like, or service for us, the information sharing agenda is growing and changing all the time. So for example, we now steward the real-time prescription monitoring service for Australia, and that is a national harmonised service now designed to support prescription monitoring, to know that, to be able to support medications safety in Australia. We have an app for those who haven't engaged with the My Health app yet. I commend it to you. And also other products like Provider Connect Australia, which is designed to be able to have a source of truth in real time around practices and around information directories about who clinicians are in the system, because there is such an enormous amount of work and rework that goes on with clinicians. If they're, you know, for example, a doctor moves practices, the amount of times that they have to tell different directories, different services, different organisations they engage with, the idea is to be able to provide, again, central repositories for that information and brokerage services that can share that out in real time. And so if you think about all of that, this is a really critical time to make sure that we have fully central those key elements that have already been touched on: transparency, accountability, our stewardship role, having the dialogue that we should have with Australians about how this works and what it is they expect. I want to touch on just a couple of others. So like Chris, I want to have a look at FOI too, because if you think again, we have My Health Record and a whole set of obligations about sharing and protection in the way I've described. We also have, as an agency, our obligations to be transparent, to engage deeply in the regimes for access to information so that there is that trust, so that we are proactively engaged in information sharing. And we've gone on a journey, like so many have, around making sure that we uplift and deeply lean into our work and role in to enable FOI requests, as well as Chris touched on, our information publication scheme, where we go more proactively even to identify and publish information. Again, really critical for people to see, you know, key elements of our information. And what you can see here is that in terms of what people are asking about, a lot of our FOI requests are about My Health Record. That is, it's about their own access to their own information. And so how we engage on that really matters, because it goes back then directly to that other role in ensuring that we support people in their engagement with their own record, their digital health literacy, because we need to be able to support that so people, when they do have that information, can really engage deeply with it. And then, of course, then to support the foundational aspects of the system itself. And that really matters too in an environment we currently have where we can't compel clinicians to upload that information. Now, we will get there, that's where we're going, but right now that isn't the case. So we need to talk to Australians about encouraging their practitioners to upload as we go on that journey to start to move to a share by default agenda. And as I said, that is going to make it a requirement, starting with pathology and diagnostic imaging, and that will really enable this environment to more fully grow on itself. So the more information that's available, the more it's useful, the more Australians demand it because it's there and it is helpful, the more it goes in, and so on. And this really starts to get that virtuous circle, which was what was envisaged all along. And it really, and what's really interesting is over the last few years, this has grown already. And what we're seeing now is, even with this signalling of a changed policy environment, it's growing on itself. So the signalling itself starts to change the dynamic. You can see there, they're the stats around different parts of the health system registered with and using My Health Record. And you can see, you know, pretty strong on GPs, pharmacies and public hospitals. Roll back a few years, other parts of the system like specialists and aged care providers, very really low engagement, and that has lifted substantially. Now, some of that is work that we do with those parts of the health system. Some of it, for example, is part of our role in the response to the Aged Care Royal Commission, but it is growing on itself, and the engagement, and the more that happens, the more that network effect means that the information is available across a person's health journey. We're also seeing uplift all round. So you can see there just a little bit of a snapshot. It's now 24 million. It grows all the time. We've got about 1.2 billion documents. So we're talking about really extraordinary numbers of data holdings. They are put in by consumers and healthcare providers, because of course you can put in your own information. And really interestingly, we have, just to touch on our engagement with First Nations organisations and communities, large number of communities and Aboriginal community controlled health organisations who input local information about the traditional medicines that people are using. So when their doctor engages with them, they have a holistic view of the different medicines, both traditional and Western medicines that First Nations people are using. So a more holistic engagement with people and their health and well-being, and the way they are supporting and managing their own health and well-being. We've seen the volumes are growing. You can see all of that, and really interestingly, growing numbers of people who check who's accessed their record. So really important that people go in and say, hang on, I'm not quite sure, I don't think that's right. And of course, they can then engage with us on checking and testing that. Also, more people are asking and demanding. So in exactly the same way that you've heard from Chris and Gail, this is a revolution in what people expect from their health system and their own health information. They don't want to have to retell their stories. They don't understand why it is. I did a test last week. Someone's telling me I have to have it again. I'm pretty sure I've already done that. They want to be able to engage with their doctors about their whole person, knowing what it is, all elements of the work they're doing. And that really matters, particularly for people, for example, with chronic conditions and older Australians, and so on. And share by default. So as I said, this will be the policy change that really lights up this ability for us to have the information that we need at our fingertips. And it really is kind of the lightning rod, I think, then for responding to that demand, having the information available and growing it on itself. And it's really critical too for medication safety. So at the moment, often it is really hard for people to remember. You go to the doctor and they say, what are you on? Oh, it's the pink one. I think it's this. The ability to have right in front of you all those medications, both current and previous, and have all of that available and have it in transitions of care. So I'm going from my GP, I've got to go to hospital, available right there for me, so that when I'm walking into ED or coming into ED, that information is also available there. So it really makes an appreciable difference. And if we start to think, so what we start to think about here is the ability to have all this information and then to have it in near real time. So this is quite different. If you think about the beginnings of this, we have a sort of fairly strongly PDF-based health information hub. We need to move obviously beyond that into something that can imbibe information more quickly in a really standardised way. So to the point Chris was making about some information, you need it to be standardised. It has to be rules-based, has to be understood in the same way across the system, and it has to be able to be available in a much more dynamic way. Enter the health information exchange. So this is, if you start to think about what's beyond this, I've talked a little bit about the consumer-facing part of the system, but what about the information that's needed to be shared across the health system, of which in and out of you and me is a part of it, but also clinicians engaging with each other. And this is the medium-term goal, where you think, if you like, in my terms, a kind of network of networks, where you've got information, as I said, My Health Record as our sort of consumer-facing hub, but information passing around the system where it is needed. And in that environment, it's really critical that the settings are all as they need to be. The regulatory environment, the legislative settings, the consent-based model, who owns, what's understood, who's authorised, who is identified. Every single one of those pieces matters. And that needs to happen at a national level. So that requires significant collaboration between the states and territories and the Commonwealth. And that work is underway under an intergovernmental agreement on digital health, for which the architecture, if you like, is agreed. And the first piece of work to be done under that, which is a national provider directory, so that all of that is understood together, is agreed, and the work in that is underway. But all of this, there's an enormous body of work. That is a medium-term goal, because the harmonisation, the legislative and policy settings that are needed are really critical right across the nation. And if we, again, I just don't want to go deeply into AI. Chris done a much better job than I could, but just if you think about the things that Chris posed in the possibilities of AI and other data-driven technologies, you've got to have an abundance of high-quality data. So you have to have all of this framed in a high-quality, clearly understood way, shared in a consistent manner, to be able to harness it, to be able to use it in that kind of way. And so it's critical that all of this work and all of the work that we call interoperability, the things that the data sharing standards that underpin all of this, is done really deeply and consistently to support those capabilities. So when they're in, the information there is trusted, consistent, and shared and understood. And these are clinical systems. So it's absolutely important that it is clinically appropriate. This is your health, this is my health, the health of everybody that we care about. And so we need to make sure that this is a safe and trusted environment. And that's why we're part of that whole of government effort that Chris spoke about, really critically to think about which bit of that do we need to engage with, what does it mean for the healthcare system as we look at that entire whole of government suite. And as we do that, it's this real dichotomy between an environment that is going to have more sharing and the protections that are needed for the trust to be maintained in that system. And we can, things like the MediSecure event recently and others we all know about, challenge the trust and how we continue to have the conversation we need to have, really debate the balanced priorities to make sure that we can do this in the right possible way. And last thing from me is just, when we think about this, we're talking about your information at a personal level. You also think about the possibilities of this with, say, AI tools and so on to kind of amplify it, for using de-identified data at a population level. So you can have not only everything we know about you available at the moment you need it, but also that opportunity for the best of population health, the best of research. That is another domain that is absolutely critical here and that we get right. Now, at the moment, the way the My Health Record was set up was designed for that not to be the case early on. But there were frameworks put in place that have to enable that conversation to begin. And there's a whole lot of legislative and technical work that would be needed for that to come to life. But it is absolutely the next conversation that we need to have together. How would we do that to be able to share insights, your demography, over people's life journeys, different parts of Australia and so on. And the opportunities for this in a network of networks are huge. We have to get them right, and there's an enormous amount to do. We're doing that work with the Department of Health and Aged Care and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, who are the data custodians for the possible secondary use framework, in really thinking about how you would stage that out, because it requires a pretty careful, pretty staged plan, but also a really big national conversation. And so if you think about all of this, it becomes more complex, more critical that we can engage really deeply and hold the trust, hold the protections, while we also go on a journey to share the information that is yours, that is going to provide support your clinicians with to support your better healthcare. Cyber and the cybersecurity elements of that are obviously an absolutely critical part of this work. So I'll stop there too, but suffice to say, this is an incredible time to be having these conversations about sharing, about security, about trust. And as stewards, we all, absolutely all share that deeply. We share it in our part of the world, you share it in yours, and how we together use these forums to have the synergies, the engagement and the testing and checking that we need to do this, to really acquit our role as stewards to support Australians. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I don't think we could have asked for a better use case to demonstrate the value of individual access to information, but also the collective value of information and how we share and apply that information to better serve the community. Now, we've run over time. It's always going to happen. We've got people who are passionate about their work.
Thank you all for coming back for part 2 of our session. It is my pleasure to introduce our FOI Commissioner, Tony Pirani, to the stage.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you everyone for returning after a very nice morning tea break. And I also want to just acknowledge we have, I think, about 200 attendees online for this event this morning. So big shout out to everyone online. Normally that would be me sitting at home engaging online, but it is really nice to be here in person. So let's see if I can get the technology to work. So this morning I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the FOI landscape, and the things that I will cover are listed there on the slide. I won't go through them and read them out to you, but that's kind of where we're going for the next half an hour to 45 minutes. So you don't get a new speaker every 15 minutes. I'm really sorry. And they're a really hard act to follow. So bear with me. So firstly, I want to talk to you about my priorities as the Freedom of Information Commissioner. And I will go into these in a little bit more detail, and we have fleshed them out a bit. But pretty much open government is a big priority. How we do our regulation at the OAIC is a big part of it. Uplifting the capability in agencies for FOI, because our success is your success and vice versa. So the more we can do to uplift capability, the better the entire system will be. And also looking at ways that we can make compliance easier. So the first priority, and this is becoming a bit of a familiar chart. I know starting earlier this year when Liz was the Freedom of Information Commissioner, she embarked on a program of meeting with agency heads, and this was something that she used to talk them through what our priorities are and what we're doing. I've continued that with some of the smaller agencies. So what we've heard is we actually have quite a high level of engagement with agency heads who understand that FOA is an important legal obligation. And our view is that if your agency heads are supportive of what you're doing as FOI practitioners, it will make your job easier. So we also work in FOI every day. We know that it's a really tough balancing act that you're going through to try and find reasons to release documents, to find ways for people to access their own information, to find ways for people to access the rich data that the government holds. That is a national resource for the people of Australia. So we really are looking to promote open government and participation in government decision making, which is enshrined in the FOI legislation, and to ensure that information held by government is managed for a public purpose and as a national resource. So what we're looking to develop is a pro-disclosure culture, and I think some of the feedback that we hear is maybe that's not where government has always been in relation to FOI, and so how we bring around that cultural shift will be really important. And the mainstreaming aspect, which is the theme of today's presentation and the week that we're celebrating International Access to Information Day, is about mainstreaming. So how can we foster an open by design culture so that when programs are actually being designed, they're designed in a way that makes it easier for information to be disclosed, not that that becomes a problem that has to be addressed afterwards because it wasn't thought about at the start. So our second priority is in relation to increasing the OAIC's FOI regulatory and case management effectiveness. And that's a journey that we've been on for quite a while now, and we're really starting to see some results of how we have shifted our approach to our regulatory work. We would like to think that you might have seen some of those changes over the last 12 months or so. We're certainly seeing the results in our casework, and I will show you what some of those results are. But we have really shifted how we have dealt not just with you as agencies, but also with applicants to take a more robust regulatory posture. So what you might have seen in the past is that we would ask you to do things, and then we had a lot of other cases that we could work on. So we might not have necessarily followed you up if you didn't do it. You might not have heard any more on that case for another 12 or 18 months because we just never quite got back to it. Whereas now, hopefully what you're seeing is that if we ask for something to be done, we want it to be done in time. We will follow you up quite promptly if you don't do it. And we also will do what we say we will do. If we say we're going to do something, we will do it. If we tell an applicant that we're going to close their matter because they haven't responded, we will do that. Whereas in the past, what might have happened is that we might have told an applicant that we were going to close their case. Then we would have gone on to another case, and another case, and another case. And then 6 months later or so, we might come back and go, oh, oops, we haven't closed that case. And now it's a bit rough to close it 6 months later. So then we have to go and do that again. So it's some of those streamlining by just emphasising with our staff that if we say we're going to do something, we will do it. And that has had huge benefits for us in terms of how we've been managing our caseload. Our third priority is in relation to uplifting the capability of agencies in relation to the FOI function. And today's event is part of that as we look to engage with you. You've probably also seen our webinar series, which we've had really positive responses to. So we've also done our practitioner survey, which I will talk to you a bit more detail what the outcomes of that survey has been. And so we're really looking at ways that we can work with you to make your job easier and to make our job easier and to improve outcomes for the Australian community. And as Amanda mentioned in her presentation earlier, her work is about maintaining the trust of Australians. Our work is also about maintaining the trust of Australians. I think you would all know, working in this area, that normally something comes to FOI not because people just want to use FOI. Normally something else has gone wrong. And something's happened and FOI is seen as the way of potentially solving whatever that thing is that's gone wrong. So if we do it well, if we can release documents and give transparency and help people, then we can actually build trust, not just in FOI, but in the whole system of government. If we don't do that, and if we're, redacting large slabs of documents because they're irrelevant to the request, or we think that there's, it's not quite on point, or whatever it might be, that can actually dilute trust in government, because people don't know. I know, because I review your decisions, that quite often what's under that blacked out or whited out these days, there's often nothing to see here. It's pretty boring, pretty mundane stuff quite often. But of course, the FOI applicant doesn't know that. And their perception is that there's obviously something really interesting to see here that they're not telling me this thing. So it's being really measured in how we use our redactions and how we, what's the real harm here? And even in terms of how we define what documents are within scope. Anyway, moving on to the final one, priority 4, making FOI compliance easier. We are really looking at opportunities that we can use to make your compliance easier and to promote a low-cost, high-impact practices. So some of these measures are things like the information publication scheme, where we have recently reviewed that scheme. I will go into a bit more detail later about exactly what we found. But promoting open disclosure of documents and doing that early can actually make it easier down the track, because people don't have to ask for that information. As we heard earlier from our panel this morning, there's some incredible initiatives going on across government to really promote access to data, to, consolidate our approach to how we use AI. So just tapping into those as well. Okay, now I want to share with you, and this slide makes me very happy. It's going to make me even happier, I hope, by this time next year. This is the history of IC reviews received and decided by the OIIC since we began back in 2010. Now, I first came to work at the OIIC in 2012, and the reason I came to work in the OIIC then was because we had a backlog of IC reviews. So you see 2012, the backlog down there, not really a backlog relatively. We have finally, in the last financial year, seen a levelling off. So you'll see that the dotted line is almost a horizontal line between 2023 and 2024. And that shows that we are finally at a turning point of reducing our backlog. Earlier this year, we hit a high of 2,273 IC reviews on hand. As of yesterday, when I checked, we were down to 1,807. So we've now eaten into that backlog by around about 450 odd cases from where we were. So we're starting to really see some momentum in our work. You'll see, even though we didn't quite finalise more cases than we received last financial year, we went very close. And we are still seeing quite a significant number of deemed access refusals coming in as well. So if we could reduce the number of deemed access refusals coming in, we would be finalising more matters than we are receiving. That's the first slide I'm really happy with. This slide actually shows the percentage of IC reviews as a proportion of all FOI requests that are made to the Commonwealth. It's still, it has increased, so that's the dotted line, if you like, with the legend down the left-hand side. We were, I think, around about 6%. We're now down around 5%. That's still higher than we would like it to be. And historically, we've been more around 2 to 3%. And I think that does tend to be borne out a bit by the volume of deemed access refusal decisions we receive. So anything that you as agencies can do to avoid matters becoming deemed, we are very grateful for. So that would be something to look at. And look, as I said, our success is your success. I appreciate that the work that we've done in the last 12 months to reduce our backlog has been possible because of your engagement with those matters as agencies, and that often the turnaround times that we impose on keeping those matters moving can be quite tight. And because many of them are matters that are we're now not got too many matters over 4 years old, but we did have matters over 5 years old. They're probably not decisions that you were even involved in at the time. They're probably matters that were decided by someone else. They're quite complex. They tend to get old for a reason. And it has required, we know, a lot of work on your part to get across those matters and to keep them progressing. So thank you very much for your contribution to that. I'm going to move on to what will be appearing in our annual report in the coming weeks, which is the result of the annual statistics for agencies. So this is an overview of how it's looked for the last decade, so from 2014 to the end of the 2023-24 financial year. As Liz mentioned earlier, overall the number of FOI requests being received by agencies has remained reasonably stable, and there certainly was very little change between last year and this year in terms of the numbers that were received, at around about 34,000 requests across the Commonwealth. Again, the timing, the proportion of matters decided within time was 74%, and that has remained steady over about the last 2 years as well. So that's good. There are some things, though, that have been a bit concerning to us, which is that since 2018-19, the percentage of FOI requests refused in full has been steadily increasing. In 2018-19, it was 13%. Last year, it was 23%. So that's quite a marked increase in the number of matters being refused in full. I already mentioned the percentage that have proceeded to Information Commissioner review. It's up from 4.8% in 22-23. So we would like agencies to have a think about the way that matters are being decided, how matters are being, how you're working with applicants in relation to the scope of requests, and whether there are ways. I think one of our speakers this morning talked about finding reasons to release information, and I think that's probably a cultural shift that we would like to see come about. So this is just a bit of a summary slide of what we've seen in the last year. So it was only a 1% increase in the number of FOI requests received. Still really high proportion, so 72% of all requests were access to personal information. Now, we don't know whether that is all about individuals seeking their own information, or if many of these are requests where people want personal information about other people. But one of the things that we would like to see across agencies, and we're starting to see, I think our speakers this morning reflected on, was more proactive ways for people to have access to their own personal information that doesn't require them to go through an FOI process. We see a lot of it in, I'm sure you're all familiar with MyGov. We heard about My Health Record this morning. So these are great initiatives that are allowing people to get their own personal information. But we do see some other parts of government, and one example is Department of Home Affairs, where a lot of people seeking their own personal information have to go through an FOI process in order to obtain that. We had 21% of all requests were granted in full. This is a drop off from 25% in 22-23. So again, we're seeing an inclination towards releasing less if you look at this data. Section 47F is the most applied exemption. That's the exemption around personal privacy, with that being 39% of all exemptions claimed. We also see a lot of exemption claims around Section 47 capital E's, which is certain operation of agencies, Section 47C, deliberative, Section 38, secrecy provisions, and Section 37. This year, there were 15% fewer practical refusal notices issued, and 38% of those were subsequently processed. So that's showing a reasonable level of engagement between agencies and applicants to have those matters progress. We still see a lot of practical refusal matters and a lot of searches matters coming through to us for review. And that is in our last 12-month caseload, we're still seeing a very large proportion of those coming through. 74% of requests were decided in time, which was the same as 22-23. And we had 2,481 new entries added to agency disclosure logs. So that was very similar to 22-23. However, only 75% of those are actually by virtue of a direct link from your agency websites. Some agencies, we're aware, are still requiring people to ask for access to disclosure log material. We also saw a 7% decrease in internal review applications, with 55% of internal reviews affirming the original decision. I'm now going to talk a bit about the work we did last year to review the information publication scheme. So 2023 was our third statutory review. We have to do this once every 5 years. And again, we thank you all for your engagement in that process. The scheme requires agencies to publish a broad range of information, and it's a really important element of that pro-disclosure culture that I was talking about earlier. So the results show a continued commitment to the information publication scheme, and we have identified, though, that there is a lot more that could be done in relation to managing government held information. So there is more information on our website about the IPS review. We're using it as a really key part of our intelligence in terms of where we need to focus our efforts as a regulatory agency. So we will be drawing on this resource and making a great deal of use of it, particularly in relation to that priority around lifting agency capability and making compliance easier. So you'll find this on our website, and that really spells out the key elements of what we found in the survey. We are also, Rossell will correct me if I'm wrong here, but we are in the process also of feeding back to you as agencies some agency-specific data on the IPS survey. Give me the thumbs up, that's good. So this is across all of government, but we will be coming out to you individually as agencies to let you know where you as an agency are doing well and where you as an agency may be able to improve. So some areas for improvement. We are looking for agencies to have an overall strategy in place to actively identify where information can be published. We are also looking at agencies, and this is consistent with what some of our speakers were saying this morning about data, to actually invest in asset management so that agencies have a clear idea of what information they hold and how it can be utilised. Agencies should identify the connections between the information that they're publishing or disclosing through FOI and the information on their disclosure log, and what could be routinely published under the information publication scheme. So looking at ways that you can streamline, be proactive, also work with other parts of your agency to understand what information is able to be disclosed and what kind of information perhaps parts of your agency want to get more disclosure of. We think training is emerging as a key issue. So training for staff to understand the proactive disclosure culture and awareness of the obligation of the IPS. Promoting feedback mechanisms, so looking at ways that people can make a complaint or provide feedback. The other thing that we have found, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's quite clear that where senior leaders in your agencies are engaged with FOI and the information publication scheme, that there's more likely to be proactive disclosure of information. So that is the IPS survey. I'll now move on to the FOI practitioners survey. So this is what you told us about what your practices are and what your needs are. So we had 147 agencies complete the survey. We found that 82% of agencies reported that the FOI guidelines were the most useful resource that we provide to you. With over half of agencies using our resources at least weekly, so 32% using them weekly, 14% fortnightly, and 13% monthly. And another interesting finding is that agencies with an integrated records management system and a comprehensive records management policy rated their ability to manage FOI requests more positively than agencies that did not have those tools available. So, as I said in relation to the IPS survey, training came out as a really huge theme in this survey as well. It found that most agencies are using informal on-the-job training and internal resources, and about 40% are relying on the Australian Government solicitor and their internal legal teams to assist them with FOI training. Pleasingly, we found that 84% of agencies indicated that the staff in their agencies are subscribed to receive our Icon Alert. 84% is good. We would like it to be higher. So if you're not, I take it if you're here, you are subscribed to our Icon Alert. But if you're online or you know other people who ought to be subscribing, would love you to promote that. We now put that out monthly. And that's for us been a good cadence to make sure that we're updating you on a really regular basis. Agencies found that some resources would be more helpful. So the kinds of things that you would like from us are things like fact sheets and those sorts of aids. We did ask about e-learning modules, but they were voted least useful. So that is an interesting finding. We also asked about subject matter. And so the top 5 or 6 for these that you would like us to tell you more about are the conditional exemptions, exemptions generally, decision making, procedural requirements, and practical refusals. So hopefully that's useful, and it's also information that we have been using to inform ourselves about how we are providing support to you. And you would have seen in recent months, we've now rolled out, I think, 3 webinars, which have been really well attended. And we've been using that feedback to inform us as to what to cover in those. So it's just a bit of a stock take of the guidance that we do provide to you. My personal favourite, and from the survey clearly yours as well, are the FOI guidelines, which are comprehensive and, as Liz mentioned, a really comprehensive tool that there's not much in there. I've now been working on IC reviews since last May, and I think there's actually only been about 1 or 2 matters that I've decided that have required a change to the guidelines. So it's pretty comprehensive. Everything's there. But in addition to that, we do have our practice directions, which were updated earlier this year, taking effect on the 1st of July. And they're practice directions not just for you as agencies, but we also have practice directions for applicants who are seeking review at the OAIC. We have a range of checklists. We have a range of templates and notices that we use. There's a video, there's the FOI Essentials Toolkit. So I would commend all of those to you. This work doesn't end. We're constantly updating our tools and also developing new ones. So what you can expect to see in the near future is some updates to the guidelines. We've made some changes to the exemptions in Part 5. We've made changes to the conditional exemptions in Part 6. We've updated Part 9, which is about internal agency review of decisions. We've also updated Part 10 to reflect the new practice direction, and that deals with reviews by the Information Commissioner. And we've also, last year, we updated Part 13 on the Information Publication Scheme. We do go through a public consultation period when we issue new FOI guidelines, and we advise of any of those consultation processes through the ICON newsletter. This year, we've also updated part 2 of the guidelines, and it's quite topical. One of the changes that we made to part 2 of the guidelines was to reflect the Federal Court's decision in the Patrick litigation about ministers' matters. That matter did go on appeal and is being handed down at 4:30 this afternoon for all of the FOI boffins who might want to tune into that. We were due to issue some further materials on ministers' documents, but they are with me for clearance, and so that's where they're going to stay now until we've had a chance to consider what the full Federal Court has to say about that issue. But we did clarify in that update to the guidelines just what the role of agencies is when providing support to ministers' offices. It's not consistent across the Commonwealth, but we are aware that many of you not only do FOI processing for your agency, but also for your minister's office. Not all agencies do that, but there have been some issues around applicants understanding whether their request has been treated as a request to the minister or a request to the agency. So we've suggested that some clarity around that would be good. We've also, we are preparing to issue a self-assessment tool. So this is a tool, it's not yet out, but it is one that we will be encouraging you as agencies to use just to tell you a bit more about the health of your FOI practice. We may also use it when we're dealing with complaints. And I should have mentioned our very major success in relation to complaints, where we have entirely cleared our backlog of FOI complaints, and we are now dealing with contemporary FOI complaints. So you're going to find it less useful to say we don't do it that way anymore. And one of the things that we're thinking of using this self-assessment tool is where we are going through a complaints process, actually asking you to complete that and provide information to us about where some of the gaps might be. We're also looking at developing some e-learning modules to roll out. That's pretty early days on that one. And I have mentioned the guidance on ministers' documents that you now won't be getting for a little while. Now, look, I could talk to you for hours about Information Commissioner reviewed decisions, but I don't think I will. What we've done here is just extracted for you some of the themes of some of the decisions that we have handed down. As I said, we have a lot of matters around searches. We have had a lot of matters over the years. We are prioritising searches matters as ones that we wish to resolve more quickly, perhaps than other matters, mainly because in many of those matters, the applicant may not have had a decision at all. So it's not a question of reviewing how your decision's been made, but rather whether the documents have been found. We have in the practice direction implemented a streamlined way of searches matters coming through the IC review process. So you will be seeing those turn over a lot more quickly. We also, I think we no longer, I might be slightly out of date, but I think we no longer have any charges matters in our caseload. Rochelle's given me the thumbs up, so unless one's come in this morning, we have cleared all of those and hopefully made our view on charging quite clear. The other one, practical refusals. We have a lot of practical refusals in our caseload, and it's another cohort that we've been prioritising. again on the basis that if an applicant has had a practical refusal, they won't have had an initial decision on their FOI request. We are still seeing a lot of them in our more recent matters that are being filed this year. So practical refusals are clearly a big theme. I could talk a bit more about practical refusals in the sense of the things that we're seeing, but I think what it all really does come back to is engagement with the applicant and making sure that they have a real opportunity to engage with the process, confine their request hopefully to something that's manageable so that the request can proceed through to be finalised. What else have we got up there? Documents of a minister. Well, we're going to get a lot more guidance on that today. I did finalise one of those matters earlier this year because it was one where we actually held the documents. Due to our case management, the documents were with us. And based on the judgment of the single judge, that put us in a position to actually be able to process that matter. So for the time being, until maybe 4:30 this afternoon, but we're hoping at 4:30 this afternoon, the full federal court will affirm the decision that was made by the single judge in that matter. But for the time being, the court has said that there is an obligation on ministers to preserve those documents and to preserve the rights of the FOI applicants. So we will see, but that may not be the end of the matter in any event. We have another matter involving Mr. Patrick, which was taken against the OAIC, where we succeeded in the full federal court, but this is currently subject to a special leave application in the High Court. So we may see FOI getting some airing in the High Court sometime soon. We've also had decisions around irrelevant material and removal of staff names. I will mention this one because I do see it a lot, which is where agencies take the view that because they have told the applicant that they're going to delete the names of staff, that that's enough to make the names of staff irrelevant from the FOI request. There's now several IC review decisions saying that you need to do more than that, that the applicant actually has to agree to exclude staff names from their request. It's not an automatic default setting that departments can put in place. We've done a number of decisions on legal professional privilege and including discussion around what was known as the real harm test, which is not something that we can overturn on review, but it is something that is worthy of agencies considering, in particular around shifting to a more pro-disclosure culture. Is there any actual real harm that would be caused by releasing privileged documents? And if not, that is a discretion that's open to agencies, not, however, something that as Freedom of Information Commissioner, I can do. We've done a lot of matters on secrecy provisions. We actually decided to prioritise the cohort of secrecy provision matters where we are not the experts in your secrecy provisions. You are the experts, or your agencies are the experts in your secrecy provisions. Where we find that there is a complex debate around the meaning and application of a secrecy provision, we have been referring some of those matters through to the AAT to determine. But we have also decided quite a number of Section 38 matters. We are considering whether we might do some further guidance on Section 38 matters, mainly from the point of view of applicants who must find them very strange. Because you do get a really weird result where basically the secrecy provision says, no, I can't tell you things that you already told me. No, I can't give you your own personal information back. So we think that if applicants understood that a bit more upfront, we might be able to head off some of the more difficult matters, because I'm sure they must feel like it's all a bit mad. We've also done a lot of matters on conditional exemptions. So that's just a list. I think we're going to make these slides available after, so you will be able to access all of these. These are just some ones that we've called out. And look, this is the nice slide. As a result of IC review decisions, what do we think that you're doing really well? We find that your engagement with us is generally very productive. We have found that you are implementing our decisions. We do get the occasional further review from departments to the AAT, but that's actually pretty rare. We find that you have been incorporating the learnings from IC reviews into your processes. We think that you are engaging productively with applicants, certainly at the IC review stage. We are seeing lots of examples where you are able to facilitate access outside the FOI Act in order to give the applicant the information they seek, even though strictly under the FOI regime, it might be exempt. We have noticed that reviews of charges have been dropped, so that is good. And we've seen a very significant reduction in the number of complaints that we're receiving from FOI applicants. Just a few tips for the IC review process and what will help it work a bit better. I think we see that where agencies communicate with the applicant at the decision stage, then we get fewer disputes, or the dispute itself is more confined to a particular issue rather than being a wide-ranging, I hate everything that they did in relation to this. So the more entrenched a dispute becomes, the harder it becomes to resolve, both for us and for you. So whatever you can do early to try and resolve the dispute will pay off. Keeping good records of the searches that you've conducted. As I said, we get an awful lot of searches matters, and we also get an awful lot of matters where even when we explain to the applicant, look, you won't be able to get that piece of information because it's exempt. We think, you know, the agency's actually done a pretty good job here. Then often an applicant will say, oh yeah, but I don't think they found everything. So sometimes things will turn into a searches matter as well, as almost a last thing. So the better your records are, the more streamlined we can be in reviewing that. And I think you'll see from a lot of our searches matters, we are satisfied when that evidence is made available to us about all of the different places that you've looked and all of the people that you've asked, then the result is clear. Just making sure, another tip is when you are providing your submissions to us, that you're comprehensive in your submissions on all matters. So I do a lot of your matters. Like I might do a lot of matters for the Department of Home Affairs. I might do a lot of matters for Services Australia. So I get the hang of what you're likely to argue on particular things. But if the matter is an older one, sometimes not all of those same submissions are there. And so I'll be trying to decide something. I think, well, I know that the Department of Home Affairs thinks this about this thing, but they haven't said it in this case. And if they haven't said it in this case, I kind of can't fill the gap for you because the applicant hasn't had a chance to respond to that point. The applicant won't know that that's what you argue in every other matter. So just making sure that when we do get to that final stage and we're asking you for further submissions, particularly on older matters, that you actually go back and have a look and make sure that there's some currency to those matters and that you can put in those extra arguments that you now know to put in, for example, about staff names. So that's just a tip. And as I said earlier, don't assume that we're an expert in your secrecy provision. And I think my pet peeve is inconsistent redactions. So if you give something out, even by accident, somewhere in those documents, I'm probably going to give that same piece of information out throughout the documents, and it happens a lot. And again, I can't kind of fill that gap for you by saying, oh, although I think I might have done it once, where I think you might have done that by mistake. But it's, and I know you've got huge volumes of documents. You've probably got several people working on doing redactions. It is a tricky thing to get it right, but it is very difficult at review for us to fix those errors. And the final one, as I said, a lot of agencies already do this, but consider providing access, even if, strictly speaking, there might be exemptions under the FOI Act. If there's, you know, really no problem with giving out that piece of information, applicants prefer to get something boring and mundane to something that's blacked out. They'll always think that the blacked out thing is that really secret core piece of information that the government's withholding from them, when it may actually just be, oh, heard you broke your leg on your holiday. Are you okay now? Something of that ilk. So that brings me to the conclusion, and thank you very much for your time.
I'm going to hand over to Liz to close out the conference, but before I do so, I just wanted to say a very big thank you to the staff, the OASC staff that are here today, Michelle, Lisa, Karen and Zara, and our comms team online, Andrew and Eva, who've really just helped make today happen, and also to the FOI branch at the OAIC who promote FOI every day. So handing over to Liz.
Thank you. One of the great pleasures and honours of working in this space is to be working with people who are values driven. And I think you've seen that from the presentations from the panel, from Tony, from Rossell and from our FOI team who have been here since very, very early this morning and who have tirelessly put this event together with assistance from our comms team. But I also want to thank you. The vibe in the room has been one of real commitment, of real engagement, of collaboration, a respectful relationship between regulator and communities of practice, and how we might work together more effectively to ensure that you're able to perform the function that is required of you under the Act, knowing that you pass first base anyway. You represent in what you're doing that commitment to accountability, transparency, democratic values, but also I saw today real interest in the new ways, the new frontiers that we're presented with in government and how we might meet the challenges that we have in our specific domains of information governance broadly in that digital environment to better serve and to better uphold the principles that we achieve through the exercise of our statutory functions, but also importantly the APS values. And I just want to call out that last piece that Rossell has highlighted in how we work together more, how we work with the APS, how we might work together with ANZSOG, how we collectively maximise the skill that's not only in this room, but available to us in the environment. So it's just been an absolute joy for me today to be here on my first Access to Information Day. I hope you've felt some of that same feeling of affirmation in the work that you do, and know that you do it for the citizens, for the community of Australians that we all serve. And you play an incredibly important role. Thank you.